Silver Swan, living and welcome to another Cordus Conversation. This time we're thrilled beyond belief to have with us composer Michael Bussewitz-Quarm. And of course we have with us our Cordus Mundi music director, Timothy Harrell. And I'm Rick Rosen, our artistic director and founder. Cordus Mundi has had the privilege of doing a couple of Michael's pieces, one of which is the Silver Swan, another called the Pasture. Tim, I don't know if you have your music with you.
I do.
Okay, good. And I do as well. And I know we both have a couple questions, but I wanted to give Michael an opportunity first to tell us about the Silver Swan, or how that came to be, what it means to you.
Well, the Silver Swan, and thanks for having me. This is a treat for me. The Silver Swan is based on a beautiful set of lyrics, actually, that are very, very old. And of course, this happens to me at the beginning of interviews. I blank on names. I don't know if you have it in front of you, what it's based
Orlando
on.
Gibbons.
Orlando, thank you, Orlando Gibbons. I wanted to say another name, and of course, once you have another name in your head, you can't undo that. So, Orlando Gibbons. And I found it beautiful, and I found the poetry of it just to, really stood out to me. When I first started organizing summer choirs for my music, it was shortly after 9/11. Well, I'd say it wasn't shortly after 9/11. It was a good 4 or 5 years after 9/11. And one of the groups that I wanted to give attention to was a group called 911 Veterans. And 911 Veterans is a local organization that they're a non-for-profit that works with local veterans in need, often in crisis, and need emergency funding to pay like a month's rent or a couch to sleep on, or car repair. It's when they don't have other opportunities to get something, and it's meant as like just a holdover until they're able to get help either from the government or from whatever sources they have. A very important organization. Everybody in the organization is a volunteer. And I wanted to, bring attention to our local veterans in crisis. And I thought that would be a nice connection to the piece that I had written for the first responders of 9/11. Anyway, to make a long story short, one of the groups that was connected, or one of the people that were connected in a way, was a family of, oh boy, again, drawing a blank, of this.
Joe Dwyer.
Thank you, Joe Dwyer. Joe Dwyer actually grew up, his family resided in the town over from us. In fact, there's a street that's named after him. He was a medic in the Iraq War, the first Iraq War. Who was made famous by carrying an Iraqi child to safety. He was, I believe his picture was on the front of a Time magazine, the cover of Time magazine. Yeah, and, the story after he came home was a very sad story. And what had become an all too common story, and still probably to this day, is a serious crisis. And that is that he eventually lost his life to suicide. He was not the same after he returned, according to his wife. Ultimately it led to his death. So, his story of losing his life to suicide was something that, again, got attention, mostly because he was the soldier that, was made famous on the front of Time magazine cover. So he really, after his death, his story became something that was powerful, and brought a lot of attention, needed attention to veterans in crisis. And so the song is really basically written for him, Silver Swan, because again, it says, when death approached, unlocked, and I believe I changed the pronoun to his silent voice in this case, because of the fact that, his struggle gave a voice to a lot of veterans that are struggling.
Let me ask you a kind of in the weeds, nerdy musical interpretation question. All right. We, and again, I'll be the marketing guy as well. This is on our recently released CD, Cordus Mundi Unforgettable, which you can get at all of your local outlets, on the website, on any of the online services. Your tempo marking is a quarter note 80, and we stayed at that tempo as we began. And then when we get to the phrase that says, "More geese than swans now live, more fools than wise," we picked the tempo up. How does that sound to you?
I have learned as a composer that something that sits with me at a certain time when I compose doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be interpreted that way, and that's a good thing. Just for an example, there was another piece that I had written, and I went to the performance of it, and they performed it very, very slow. And I was, at first I was like shocked by the tempo. I was thinking, wow, this is going to be a long performance. It actually, at first I was a little anxious because I felt that the beginning didn't really sit well with the tempo didn't really sit well with it. And then when they got to the middle section, it was so incredibly powerful in a way I'd never heard it before. And I think what I've learned is, we can corral the music, we can put it in front of people, and as long as they are respecting the piece, I'm very eager to hear what interpretation it is. And that, to me, I feel like is an interpretation that probably, well, I know it worked beautiful because I heard your recording. I love Cordus Mundi's recording of the Silver Swan. It's beautiful. It's very passionate. You can hear the emotion coming through, especially at the forte in the second part when it builds. More geese than swans now live. It's so powerful.
And it's emotional to sing. It's incredibly emotional to sing at that point.
Yeah.
And that repeat, the second ending doing it forte. And when we sing no more, sorry, I'm going to tear up even now, remembering what it felt like to do that, because there's so much pathos in what you've done with that text.
Such an incredibly sad story, and one that I could put to music because I think sometimes if you're too close to the story, you can actually have trouble setting it, even if it's a sad story. You have trouble finding the music to it. But I care a lot about, the people in 911 veterans, and, obviously there was a connection to me emotionally with, with first responders and 9/11. Because it was all part of the same project. So, so for me, there was a lot of emotion that went into it. Yeah.
Do you find that in a lot of your writing? Because it's just our few pieces, we feel that.
Well, yes, for me, and I would guess that this is something that a lot of composers feel. It's very therapeutic to write. For me, I have, I lived with chronic disability my entire life. So, so there's, whereas I used to maybe want to run as an outlet, or even perform as a pianist as an outlet, those things are not necessarily available to me as much anymore. Well, running certainly, but even performing piano with fused wrist, it makes it much more difficult, and a shoulder replacement. So for me, my outlet for expressing my, what I need to, is through writing. And of course, that's only half the equation, because I can't have that come out because I'm not the performer. The choir is the performer. And that's just, for somebody who's walked my journey, to actually have people coming along the road with me now and being part of this outlet of emotion is just the most incredible, amazing feeling. You know, I love writing for ensembles because of the people I meet and the emotion that I hear coming through the music. So it seems like people relate to it.
Yes.
So that's a good thing.
Yeah, Tim did this. Let's talk about your journey. Let's talk about your journey. However you would like to lay this out for us, but tell us about your journey.
Sure. Well, like I'd mentioned, you know, I've lived my life with chronic disability, and you know, I grew up on Long Island with a single mom and two sisters. We went through some tough times. My mother, this was back in the 70s. My father was what was called a deadbeat dad, and so we were on welfare for a while, and you know, we had to find ways to make ends meet, and my mom brought us through some very tough times. She's a very strong woman. And, you know, through that time also, I was diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. At that point, it was the severity was very rare. I think there were like 4 documented cases that were as severe as I was. And living on Long Island, luckily I had the opportunity to be treated in New York City by some very fine doctors at Cornell Medical Center. But you know, one of the things that my mother decided to do was have me learn piano, because she knew that I was going to I wouldn't have the opportunities that other kids might have with the disability that I had, the physical limitations, and also the fact that I needed to be removed because of I was immunocompromised. I needed to be removed from, you know, from society, which actually seems to be what's going on right now for all of us, or, you know.
Ahead of your time.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, so I learned the piano, and I loved conducting. I remember setting up the when Star Wars came out, shortly after that, we had a phonograph, you know, like a big box phonograph, and somebody had bought me, I guess my mom probably, the John Williams and the London Symphony performing Star Wars, and I would put the record on the phonograph. I'd line up the chair, the couch would be the brass section, and the chair would be the strings, and you know, I'd sit there flapping my arms around, not knowing what I was doing, but just loving that experience. And you know, so music was a big part of my emotional outlet, my joy growing up. That and camping. I love camping in the mountains. We would go out. It wasn't very expensive to go on vacation in a tent, so that's what we did and growing up. And so I have very fond memories of being in a leaky tent in the middle of the White Mountains of New Hampshire. I mean, we had to hang up. There was one time when there was a big storm, we had to go and hang up all of our everything on these lines to dry out. But it didn't stop us from having a great time. You know, camping is great. So anyway, you know, that I think those there were some challenges with financial stress with the family and my disability, but there were also joys through music and through the mountains. I remember those things standing out really well. So that was my part of my journey. As you both know, I don't know how many listeners know, but I am transgender. That was something that I came to realize probably sometime in high school. But this was the 80s, and there was little known about that. It was before the internet, and there was a lot of confusion as to what was going on with me inside. And very few people I could talk to, but my mother did actually afford me the opportunity to go to somebody to speak to, which is, you know, not always available for everybody. And I was, you know, very grateful for that. And through the next 20 years, I guess I'd say, I set out to be at peace with myself And that's been the journey I've been on. And I taught for 10 years. I taught in the public school system, which is 10 years that I will cherish, with all the kids that I worked with, and the music that I wrote during that time. After my third joint replacement with the arthritis, I realized that, I was married at the time. We had our second child come in, and actually, no, it was our first child at that time. I realized that if I didn't want to keep losing joints, public school teaching was going to be something that I'd have to let go of because of the amount of physical stress of showing up day in and day out, not to mention the emotional stress as well. But the physical was something where, I always felt like I needed to be 110% because of the fact that I knew that I would be out and absent from time to time, more than the other teacher that was next to me. And, so I needed to put my best foot forward. But it became to a point where, I needed to take care of myself more than what I was able to. So I left teaching, taught at some churches, I directed choirs at some beautiful churches locally, a Methodist church in a local town about a half an hour away. And then after my family started getting to that Sunday school age, I found a Presbyterian church locally that I worked at, taught some piano lessons. And at a certain point, I sat down with my wife and I said, look, I really want to pursue composing full time, but I'm splitting myself up too much. I can't be a good choir director, a good organist, a good piano teacher, a good parent, and a good composer. It's just too much to be good and to take care of myself at the same time, which obviously is, a little bit more goes into that than maybe somebody who's completely healthy. And so she's thinking about it and she's like, okay, let's do it. Let's do the composing full time. I was like, you realize I lose the church salary, I lose the piano lesson salary. She's like, yeah, but she's like, now, when are you going to do it if you don't do it now? And you'll regret not doing it if you don't do it. So 5 years ago, at that point, I had signed up for my first ACDA conference in Boston. It was the Eastern Division Conference. It was about the same time that I was beginning to go public. At this point, I had been really quiet and private about being trans. I gave notice at the church. It was a very sad time because I have a lot of friends there. That February, I said goodbye to the church and I went to my very first conference, completely open about being trans, and was welcomed with open arms, just a wonderful support from the people around me. I remember Mark Boyle, for example, who's in Pittsburgh, I think Seton Hill, if I'm not mistaken, but he was the person who was the go-to with the people who are, had exhibit booths up, and he was so wonderfully welcoming. And there were some other people too that were just, and it just was the most amazing feeling to be surrounded by people that I could talk to, that understood me, that I understood. I finally felt, after I started going to these conferences, that I found a tribe that I belonged to. And that was an amazing feeling. It was just an incredible feeling. And so that's where I'm at now.
What's not to love? Come on.
I know, right? I mean, everybody loves singing. Everybody, there's so much support. We're going through a tough time right now, but there will be another day. The sun will come up again, whether it's 6 months or 24 months or whenever. We will be singing again, and we're finding ways to get through it.
Amen. Let's stay with some questions in the. I know, Tim, you had some questions about composing and trans voices and.
Right. I wondered, as a composer, how you feel about that for a singer's sake, making the change and wanting to be comfortable in the choral setting and experiment with their voices.
Right. So I'd say from my experience discussing trans voices with choir directors that I've worked with, it seems to be that most trans singers feel more comfortable singing with the gender they identify with. And you know, as when you transition, obviously your voice, well, it's important to understand, I guess, that the male voice, as you can hear from me, does not transition with you know, hormone replacement therapy. It basically stays the same. For me, my voice is possibly, I don't know if I could tell in this recording, I've been at home for 60 days now without going anywhere. But societally, I think when you present yourself a certain way, sometimes subconsciously, just like when you pick up an accent, this is just my opinion. Right. There might be something to it or not, but when you live in a certain country for a certain amount of time, you sort of pick up the accent a little bit of that particular language. You know, I think that even for male to female, that even though there's no change in the vocal cords or anything like that, and they're the same vocal cords, it's possible that, you know, subconsciously our voices lighten up a little bit. I know, for example, I make a concerted effort when I'm in a situation that I feel is uncomfortable or possibly dangerous. Less so these days, those types of situations, but there are certain situations where in the past I have gone or been like to maybe a 7-Eleven or something like that, where I felt, you know what, I'm not going to, I see the people that are in there at that particular time might be somewhat assertive or aggressive or whatever, and I just don't want to let on that I'm trans. That's a little bit of background. The truth is that for a female to male person who's transitioning, the vocal cords, if I understand correctly, do actually change. That the voice does lower with the hormone therapy.
But it doesn't look the other way around.
It doesn't look the other way around. No. So I will say though that I actually was part of a consortium, a commission with the Seattle Men's Choir. And they had a trans singer who they actually recently had sing a solo. And she, male to female, she sang the solo as a baritone voice in her natural voice. And it was beautiful. And it was beautiful to see, you know. So obviously being in the Seattle Men's Chorus and being male to female, she has been made to feel comfortable singing in her own voice. Mm-hmm. You know, she's been welcomed to sing in her own voice. You know, so there are, you know, and that's a beautiful thing to see. So for me, I feel like the more we allow the entire rainbow to exist, let's say that, you know, one gender is red and the other gender is blue. You know, I explain it to kids this way. I say, I try to reverse the colors a little bit to get, you know, so that it's not stereotypical. But if boys are red and girls are blue, then I'm purple. You know, that's where I exist right here, you know, because I get the question from a 5 or a 6-year-old, and you can't go into too much of a complicated type of answer. You know, you have to meet them where they're at, and they love that, you know. And then in one case, the parents went home and painted with them, and they got to try out the purple and blue, the red and blue mixed purple kind of thing. I went off on a tangent there. I'm trying to remember to swing back here.
Painting the purple.
Yeah. So, you know, so I love the fact that that we can start existing in a spectrum of gender, that there are, you know, women who prefer to be less feminine. There are men who prefer to be less masculine, mm-hmm. But there's also people who are trans. We don't have to, I mean, in the past, I feel, at least from my understanding, is that, you know, some people prefer to, you know, to kind of be able to pass in the binary, you know, and to not let on that they were trans for safety reasons. Mm-hmm. So if you were male to female, you were able to, society accepted you more if you passed as a female, you know. And now I think we're getting to a point, at least in some parts of society, where, you can be obviously trans and you are still accepted. You know, I've, knock on wood, I've traveled, you know, a lot over the past year, to Seattle, to Omaha, Nebraska, to Indiana. I'm trying to remember the name of the small town, and you know, to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, to Eugene, Oregon, to Philly, to Pittsburgh, and everywhere I've been, I have not had, you know, and maybe I'm just fortunate. But, you know, when I speak, I think it's pretty obvious, you know, and yet I've had a lot of acceptance. So I think that singers, I still think that most singers prefer to sing in the voice part of, you know, the gender that they identify with. But there is a sensitivity to, there has to be a sensitivity. Let's put it this way. It's a good idea to have a discussion about vocal health if the choir director is able to, you know, discuss with them vocal health. And I know, for example, one choir director who had a female to male trans person in their choir, and they had a discussion with the singer saying, let's try you out on tenor because we know you want to be on tenor. Let's just try it out, and I want you to keep in touch with me about how you're feeling, how your voice is feeling, you know, because maybe we'll do a little bit of tenor and a little bit of alto for now, you know, and slowly make that transition rather than force the voice and then cause damage, you know. When you know, it's funny because I actually was a 6th grade chorus teacher for 9 out of the 10 years. And, you know, because of the fact that voices don't change at the beginning of the 6th grade, usually most of the boys in the choir hadn't gone through their voice change yet. So I was constantly, at first I was singing in my regular voice to demonstrate things. And then, you know, half the choir who had never had, 70% of my choir had never been in choir before. So let's say half the choir would try to sing down the octave. And then I realized it was much easier for me to just use my falsetto. Yes. So I had this incredible falsetto for a long time while I was teaching, you know, and I mean, I wasn't out as being trans, but it sure did do wonders for my psyche, being able to sing alto parts and you know, possibly even some soprano if I needed to at the time.
Yeah. Well, I think it really helps the child's voice to be in their octave. I've had falsetto for years too. It's going down, unfortunately, but I found it to be the case because kids are really confused with the men singing down in a low voice. The octave throws them off.
It does. It throws them off.
I mean, that's kind of the way I approach kids who can't find pitch yet sometimes. You know, try to sing a note, have them sing it back. If they can't match my note, I match theirs and go from there.
Yeah. It's a great technique.
Michael, you're clearly a passionate human being. I'm betting number one that you've always been that way. And I guess my statement and question is that you strike me as an activist. And I bet you've probably, well, I don't know, have you always been that way as well?
That's a good question. I would venture to guess that everybody is, at some level, if they really tap deep down inside, passionate about how they feel about things. I find the world that we live in right now very tough emotionally, and I don't like to feel helpless, and I like to feel like part of the solution. However, I have physical limitations. I have, you know, and with something like JRA, which, you know, is an autoimmune disease, it's greatly affected by physical stress, but also emotional stress. And so for me, I have to, you know, try to find a way to remain healthy, and be at peace within, while also, you know, living in the world that we live in, and you know, and accepting that I can't just shut out the news. I can't just turn everything off, and you know, and you know, and when I do turn on the news, I don't want to feel helpless. So, you know, for me, I have this awesome ability, you know, awesome opportunity to compose and express my own feelings about things through my music. And I'm finding that there's a lot of people that feel the same way that I do about certain things. Like, for example, The Unarmed Child, which I just wrote as a large choral work. And it has to do with victims of gun violence. Well, that's obviously a very, people feel very passionate about, what is going on in our country, and without even getting into solutions or anything like that, because I obviously feel that there are certain solutions, and other people agree with those. Some other people disagree. However, I think we can all agree that it is sad when a school has a shooting. There's nobody. we all agree with that, and so I feel like there was a way to unify us and bring us together around what we all agree is just something that needs to change. And when you see that a young child has been shot and killed, whether it's in the city of Chicago or whether it's in a suburb like Sandy Hook, there is no room for that in our society. There should be no room for that in our society. There should be solutions, and we should be listening to each other and come to solutions for that. But the song basically doesn't talk about who's to blame. It doesn't talk about what the solutions are. That's a conversation to have after you leave the concert hall. This is a choral work that just honors the victims of gun violence and their families. And for me, it was very therapeutic when I was working with the workshop choir over the summer, who, this was commissioned by 3 choirs around the country. But I workshopped it with my own choir before it came out. There were several times, where choir members would come up to me after rehearsal, broken up in tears because of what we were singing about. I understood where they were at that particular time, because that's why I wrote the piece, and to me, it gives me strength to be able to do something, or to be able to connect with people, and work through the pain that we feel together, Yeah. That was just one example of something which I felt was something I felt helpless about. And I mean, I feel a little bit less helpless now. Let's put it that way.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Let's go from there to, what are you doing? What have you recently been working on? What are you working on? What's coming up?
So my plans have changed a little bit. As I love, working as a composer in the choral field. I mean, there are many different mediums to compose for. My passion is working in the choral field. I do have some band pieces as well, and some instrumental solo works. But my attention over the last 5 years has been primarily on choral music. So we're going through a tough time where we can't be together and sing as a choral ensemble, and we have to get creative as to how we sing together. So I have a few projects that I've been developing even before the pandemic hit. One is called Where We Find Ourselves. It's based on a photo exhibit that I actually was brought to when I was at a commission down in Chapel Hill. The photo exhibit was at Duke University, at the National Museum of Duke University. And Where We Find Ourselves is based on a photo exhibit by the photography of Hugh Mangum, who basically set up studios around Durham at the turn of the century, and had portraits taken, or he took portraits of people, and he here's just so you guys could see, there's Hugh himself. in a kind of silly photo in terms of, you know, hiding behind his hat. He was very creative in the way that he did his own self photos. But, you know, getting a portrait taken back then was a big deal because there was no redos. There were no, you know, unless somebody had a lot of money, there was no second or third takes, you know, and you had to really think about how you wanted to be remembered, you know, and because a photograph lasted well beyond, you know, your own lifetime. So it was a very big deal to get a photo taken. And what I loved about him is that he subverted the basic place and time that he was in. Like, you know, it was very segregated time. There was a lot of discrimination. There was the Jim Crow laws. There was a Ku Klux Klan that was in power at the time. And yet he set up his tent and he brought in, you know, black, white, rich, poor, everybody, you know, would come to his tent and would get their portrait taken. I love the fact that his artwork spoke for him. Like, it spoke for, was it activism in his case? Well, he didn't actually go, you know, he didn't write anything about activism, but his art spoke for itself and gave dignity to every single subject that went in there. He had a relationship with every single subject that sat in front of his camera. And you could see the comfort. It's a beautiful photo exhibit. So anyway, so we're actually, myself and my lyricist, Chantel Sellers, contacted the photographers that put together the exhibit and then the book. And they're very excited about this. They're on board. And we are basically putting together a 2-season consortium, a project. The first project will exist solely online, or the first season rather, will exist solely online, where we're going to have videos of us discussing the photography, and we're going to, and then each choir that's part of the consortium will also have a session with Margaret and Alex, the photographers, and they will have a Q&A with each choir that's part of it. So we're going to do short videos, pre-recorded videos that we're going to share. Each week we'll release another one. And there's so many different subjects to speak about. You know, the props that people used, or the accessories that people used in their photography, you know, photos, the hats that they wore, and you know, if they decided to, you know, bring in any kind of props, the hair back then, you know, and the different styles, both on women and on men, and the beards, and, you know, just like everything was just so important in terms of how, you know, presentation, you know, and then of course a lot of these, you know, this photo collection was discovered in I don't want to say estate of Hugh Mangum, but like the barn, the family barn. It was in a loft about several decades ago. And so, you know, they had sat in that loft in boxes for a number of decades after he passed. And so the negatives, the glass negatives, have damage to them, you know, and it's just really fascinating, like, to see the mysteriousness behind the parts that are scarred, you know, on the edges and stuff. And it tells its own story about the fact that these were recovered and are so important to the history of the time. You know, so anyway, it's a fascinating project. And then the second season, by that point, the song will be done. The piece that everybody will be singing will be done, and that'll be passed out. And I'm going to write it in a way that they could actually, you know, do a pre-recording and premiere it virtually online, or they could do it live if by some miracle by January we're all able to sing together, which, you know, right now it's looking like that might be a little longer than that.
All right, let me stop you right there, because
yeah.
you said something I want to know more about.
Yeah.
We're all groping for how we've come up with solutions until we can all get back on stage. And that's one of the things that I'm starting to hear more and more from, and I think you just talked about, is it possible to write incorporating the latency problem into your composing? Is it possible to compose for Zoom?
Well, we're all learning, and I've been really following a lot of different groups online to try to get ideas from that. So I have picked up a few ideas. Um, First, I'll just backtrack a little bit. There are two different ways of recording and presenting a concert right now virtually. There is what I heard as the term is live remote. Live remote is set up so that every singer actually hears the other singers and you're all singing together, just from various locations. The complication with that is that it is more technically difficult, and you need to, excuse me, you need to have each computer hardwired to your modem through an Ethernet cable, which reduces the latency. And it's so it has to be where each singer, has to have a reduced amount of latency, and so there's a group in New York City, I'm sure you've heard of them before, C4.
Yes.
And C4 actually has already given a concert, a performance, and that's where I first heard my friend Karen Siegel, who I just did an online workshop with a few days ago. She had written a piece that was for the purpose of demonstrating. It's a beautiful piece. So it'll have a life after the pandemic, but the piece was written with the for our time right now that we're going through, and so it was somewhat aleatoric in nature, which allows for a little bit of latency issues without compromising the musicality of the piece, and it was beautiful. So there is that way of performing via live remote and hardwiring, to your modems or your routers. The other way, of course, to do it, which is I actually have a premiere coming out on Monday with Ithaca College, which was supposed to be a live performance back in March, and now they have done a pre-recording, which they are presenting. So each singer is listening to my rehearsal track. And I have I snap subdivisions when there's ritordandos. I give count-offs if there's a hold in the middle of the song or fermata and a cutoff, I will count them back in so that they all start at the same time.
Okay.
And so so they each then record their own part. They submit it to an audio engineer who then takes all the singers' parts, which I can imagine is overwhelming, and they then line them all up, And the other thing that's really important that I've heard is that they have each singer clap 4 beats before they start, so they can line up all the claps, and that seems to help too. That's less, that's less of an ensemble type of experience because nobody is singing with anybody else.
We've just done our very first one of them, so we're at the very beginning of that learning curve.
Yeah, that's great.
First one, in fact, like yesterday.
I
don't know if you're watching, you can see Tim and I are both taking notes like crazy.
That's great. That's how I have saved so many threads on Facebook for later reading, because it's amazing how the community is rallying together and coming up with all these different solutions, and you could see that it's refining itself even in like the last 4 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever. I mean, we've been, staying at home longer than that, but in terms of like, choir directors knowing that we're going to have to come up with solutions, people are working, hard, and collectively we're making progress.
Amen. And one of the quotes from one of the webinars or somewhere in there was somebody basically saying, okay, feel sad, get over that, and focus on not so much on what we can't do right now, but what we can do.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, exactly.
Cliche, one of humans' oldest cliches, necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, we will get through this, and there will be some very interesting new things that will come out of this. I think we'll be stronger when we come out of it, to be honest with you.
I like that thinking, and I think that obviously the skill set we're reluctantly learning here technologically becomes a part of the mix even after we can go back on stage.
And we just love our craft so much that I mean, the craft will, you know, there will be a lag in terms of return to funding. You know, I think the financial part of this is going to, you know, go the way of the economy, whatever that way is. Hopefully it recovers quickly. You know, but in terms of the numbers, in terms of the passion, it's all going to be there once we go back. You know, I really do think so.
More intense.
I want to give you a standing
yes, 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 yes.
Well, what else would we like to talk about, gentlemen?
Oh, don't know. Is there any other questions,
Well,
you guys?
I mean, we can get deep in the weeds here if you want. I mean, do you want to circle back to, do you have anything in particular to say about the other piece that we've had the privilege of doing, which is the Pasture?
Oh, I just love Robert Frost.
Well,
you know, when I first wrote this, it was presented at a workshop. Greg Smith
yes.
and the Greg Smith Singers had their summer composer workshop. It was summer, or it was at least spring, whatever. It was an annual composer workshop, and it was before I was doing this for a living, and before I knew. I mean, I always felt I could, but nobody knew who I was. Nobody knew my music at that time. And I brought it to a workshop, this particular piece, and each composer gets 30 minutes. You know, they sing through the piece, then they offer suggestions, and then they do a quick recording at the end. So I got 45 minutes, I think, actually. So they sang through it, and Greg turned to me and he had tears in his eyes. And that was one of the most amazing things to me, you know, his comments about the chords and the lushness of them. And, you know, that was my first like affirmation, you know, from somebody of Greg's stature, you know. I remember we had to go, it was right before lunch. So we went out to lunch after that. And I remember basically saying, I can't feel the sidewalk because I'm actually flying right now. You know, I was in such heaven, you know, with his emotional response, you know, from the Pasture. And it was just, you know, it was like, you know, I know I can do this, you know, I love it. So you know, you can't go wrong with Robert Frost. But I was going to say at the time, his poems weren't in the public domain. So I found that out then, that there is this thing, you know, where you have to get permission from. And, you know, Greg actually offered to speak to the estate of Robert Frost because he had some connections there. And I don't remember why I didn't follow through with that. I wasn't in the same place that I am now, where I would have said, yes, absolutely. But it turns out now at this particular time, which is like 15, 16, 17 years later, those particular poems are in the public domain, although not all of Frost's poetry is. That one in particular is. So 2 out of the 3 poems that I set are now in public domain, and you know, I'm really glad that one is.
Yes, Mazel Tov.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Have you done much with taking SAT pieces and making them TTBB?
I'm sorry?
Have you taken many of your SATB pieces and just rewritten them for TTBB?
I have. There are some that work better than others. I find that...
That's the question, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I find that there's less difficulty taking an SATB and changing it to a TTBB than there is taking an SATB and changing it to an SSAA. And the reason is because of the ranges, and you don't want to have your alto twos. I learned this the hard way, actually. Well, not the hard way, I shouldn't say that. I sent it out to a choir director to get feedback, and I got feedback right away that if I kept the alto twos on a low F and a low G the entire time, the vocal teachers in that college would come at her with pitchforks if, you know, she ever programmed it. So I was like, okay, I need to kind of mix it up a little bit. However, you know, for some TTBB choirs, you almost have the same exact range that you do as an SATB choir. You know, I'm a tenor one. I love going up to a high C. I love that, you know.
Mhm.
And even though sopranos can go higher than that, it is easier to transition down as long as, you know, we don't have the, you know, basses go lower than, well, so, you know, some choirs it's in like E flat, some choirs it's a D, some choirs bass twos can go down to a C, you know, and that's about it.
Just don't ask for a big crescendo when you're down that low.
Yeah, I know, it's got to just sit there and make the world vibrate, but
Right.
that's it. Yeah. So yeah, I do like doing that because, you know, I love, you know, some of my favorite music is, one of my favorite composers is Rachmaninoff. And another piece that I just adore, it's one of my favorite pieces, is Chechnikov's Salvation is Created.
Mhm.
It's just, you know, just gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. And, you know, so I love listening to tenor bass choirs perform. It's a beautiful sound.
Is there something of yours that you should be recommending to us as our next piece?
You know, that's a good question, and I did not think about that before. You know,
How to find us?
yeah, I know how to find you. I'm trying to think of what I have out there. Well, you know, I just wrote for the Seattle Men's Chorus, and that is, now that's not a cappella though. Do you do a cappella only? I forgot.
No, well, no. Tim is our accompanist, and we at this point we call ourselves mostly a cappella.
Right.
So,
This piece, which is yet to be premiered, it was supposed to be premiered in March, another premiere, that's being postponed, was commissioned by Seattle Men's Chorus, and it's based on, again, drawing a blank on the author. It's Speak to Us of Clothes, is the name of the poem. I'm wondering if I could quickly I really want to say the name of the author.
doing the same thing. I'm going to the other computer to see if I can find it quickly. Speak to Us of Clothes.
And the Weaver said, "Speak to Us of Clothes." Here it comes. Khalil Gibran.
Gibran.
Yeah. And wow, what beautiful poetry. Very powerful. And actually, it was very personal to me, in a sense of the, let me get you back here, in terms of the commission, because the choir, let me see if I have this right, Seattle Men's Chorus, the concert was to raise money for rescuing trans people from Iraq, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. You know, because they are very much, boy, I apologize if I have this wrong, because he told me the story, Paul told me the story at the beginning, and I want to make sure I have the country correct. I'm pretty sure it was Iraq though. You know, and their lives can be in danger in that country, being, you know, identifying as trans if they're found out. So, you know, it was a very worthy, very important thing that they were doing, you know, bringing people over to this country that were at risk of losing their lives. And obviously it spoke to me deeply. So it was an honor to write for them. The piece is on close. It's for TTBB voices with piano and soprano sax accompaniment.
Oh.
So.
All right.
Yeah. Saxophones too.
Yeah.
Alto, soprano sax. Yeah. So yeah, it's the first time I ever wrote for soprano sax, so I can't wait to hear how it sounds. I hear it up here, but you know, who knows? You know.
All right. Well, again, my colleague Tim, unless you've got anything else you want to add in here, I just hate to let Michael go. We've gone an hour here. It's gone by like that, and this is wonderful.
I feel privileged to be in this experience with you. It's just been great.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you.
You have some parting words for us? Anything you want to leave us with in particular?
You know, just I mean, first of all, you know, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.
This has been a wonderful discussion. You make your guests feel very comfortable and are very patient with your guests speaking a lot. You know, I feel like for every composer out there, maybe this is a word of advice. Remember who your circle is. And, you know, there are people like, for example, Ann Matlack in New Jersey with the Harmonium Choral Society, who showed up at my table the first time I had, you know, I'd set up an exhibit in Boston, who took time to take samples of my music and then to program me, and you know, became part of my kind of like inner circle of people I appreciate, who I've met along the way. You know, and Rick, you're becoming one of those people too, because of our various times that we've been able to talk, and the fact that you guys have programmed me a couple of times, and you know, the fact that you connect with my music. You know, there are times when as a composer, especially, you know, when you're not able to get out that much and travel that much, where you could feel very secluded, isolated, yeah, and then you have to think back to like, well, where were you 5 years ago and where are you now, you know? But also the fact that you have to think about the friends that are out there that you may not have heard from for a while because everybody's so busy. But you all have a circle, you know, and I have a circle, and, you know, thank you, both of you, Rick and Tim, for being part of that.
Oh, thank you for
There we are, ladies and gentlemen. It's been an honor and a pleasure, I think, for all three of us, right? It's been a wonderful time. And I guess, Michael, you have to end the meeting because you're in charge.
That's right. A little quirk of Zoom here. All right, great.
Thank you, one and all.
Thank you.
Stay tuned.
Take care. Bye-bye.